She's 3 years old. She knows how to unlock a tablet, navigate to YouTube, and find her favorite show before she knows how to read. She doesn't watch television the way you did. She doesn't sit in front of whatever's on. She watches what an algorithm chooses for her. Content selected not by her parents, not by a teacher, not by her own curiosity, but by a system that learned her preferences before she was old enough to have preferences she consciously chose. And child psychologists watching this in 2025 are flagging something they've never flagged before. This isn't just screen time, this is something different. And the early data is unlike anything developmental researchers have measured for any previous generation at the same age. This is Generation Alpha, born between 2010 and 2024. The largest generation in human history, 2 billion children, the experiment that's still running. And nobody, not the researchers, not the parents, not the technologists who built the systems shaping these children, knows yet exactly how it ends. We've studied generations before. The boomers who grew up inside the greatest economic expansion in American history, Gen X who raised themselves in empty houses and never complained, millennials who followed the rules and found the rules had changed, Gen Z who went through puberty while an algorithm rewired their brains. Each of those stories had enough distance that researchers could measure the outcomes. This one doesn't. Generation Alpha, the oldest members are 15 right now, is still being studied in real time. A landmark systematic review published in Springer Nature in 2024 stated clearly that much of what researchers assume about Gen Alpha is still untested. The field is still catching up to this generation's speed of development. But here's what child psychologists are saying more loudly in 2025 than they were 5 years ago. The early patterns are unlike anything they've seen before, and some of them are alarming. Before we get to screens, there's something about Gen Alpha that nobody in this conversation talks about enough. They were public before they were people. Their parents, millennials, the generation that normalized sharing everything, have been posting photos of them since before they were born. By the time a Gen Alpha child reaches adulthood, researchers estimate they will have thousands of images of themselves online, uploaded without their consent, forming a digital identity they had no hand in creating. Developmental psychologists have a word for this: sharenting. And think about what that actually means. Every previous generation got to fail privately. That 7th grade haircut. That embarrassing moment at a party. That phase you went through that you'd rather forget. For Gen Alpha, it's documented, searchable, permanent. Your memories were allowed to evolve, to become stories, to change shape the way human memory naturally works. Gen Alpha doesn't get that. They are the first generation whose childhood exists as a public archive they never agreed to. Now here's the thing about screens that the conversation always gets wrong. The issue isn't the number of hours, it's the mechanism. Early childhood, specifically the years between birth and age 7, is what neuroscientists call a critical period of neuroplasticity. The brain during these years is more receptive to environmental input than it will ever be again. What trains a child's attention, language, emotional regulation, and social cognition during this window tends to stick. And right now, what's training Gen Alpha's attention during that window is a system that was never built for them. The algorithm was never designed for your child's development. It was designed for your child's attention. And those are not the same thing. Passive consumption, algorithmically served video, endless scroll, carries completely different developmental implications than structured, educational, interactive use. The question for Gen Alpha isn't whether screens are present. Screens are present. The question is who the screen is working for. Right now, it's working for the platform. Here's something researchers are only just beginning to document about Gen Alpha that doesn't fit the standard screen time narrative. Gen Alpha shows rising anxiety, even in children who don't yet have smartphones or social media access. And that requires a different explanation. Think about what the average Gen Alpha childhood looks like compared to every generation before it. They are the most supervised, most scheduled, most digitally guided generation in history. Helicopter parenting replaced unstructured play, smartphones replaced waiting, algorithmic content replaced choosing, and developmental psychologists note the painful irony. The over-optimization of their environment, designed to protect them, may be producing the very anxiety it was meant to prevent. Here's why. The brain needs small doses of uncertainty to build the neurological infrastructure for handling large ones. A childhood without productive struggle produces an adolescence less equipped for inevitable difficulty. Every previous generation had friction in their childhood: boredom, waiting, problems with no instructions, social situations with no moderator. That friction was uncomfortable, but researchers now understand it was developmentally essential. It was the resistance that built the muscle. Gen Alpha is the first generation to grow up in an environment that has systematically, with the best of intentions, removed most of that friction. And the cumulative effect of that removal, at scale, across an entire generation? Developmental science has never had the opportunity to measure it before. One thing completely separates Gen Alpha's psychological landscape from every generation before them, including Gen Z. For every previous generation, climate change was a future concern, something coming, something to prevent. For Gen Alpha, it's already the weather of their childhood: wildfires disrupting school calendars, air quality alerts keeping them indoors, extreme heat events that cancel outdoor activities. These aren't abstract warnings. They're Tuesday. And the data shows they understand this at ages previous generations simply didn't. But here's what researchers didn't expect to find. Gen Alpha's relationship with climate isn't purely despair. Springtide research data shows a large majority see efforts to address climate change as good for society. The Boston Museum of Science survey found they believe their generation will find solutions. Gen Alpha is the first generation to grow up with climate grief as a baseline, but potentially also the first to treat solving it as simply part of the job description. They didn't choose to inherit this problem, but they seem to be deciding, earlier than any generation before them, that they're the ones who are going to have to solve it. Now, here's the most contested question about Gen Alpha, and it's contested because it's genuinely unresolved. Nearly half of 13-year-olds have already used AI, primarily for schoolwork but also for artistic expression, information seeking, and companionship, according to Springtide research. Critics worry about dependency, about a generation outsourcing thinking before it learns to think independently, about what happens when the tool that always has the answer gets taken away. But researchers who study cognitive development offer something more complicated. Gen Alpha isn't just using AI the way millennials learn to use email or Gen X learn to use the internet. They are co-evolving with it, growing up alongside it. In the same way that language shaped the brain of every human generation before written language existed, AI may be shaping cognitive development in Gen Alpha in ways we can't yet fully measure. No previous generation has done this, which means no researcher can yet say with certainty what it produces. The honest answer is, we don't know, and that might be the most important thing to hold on to about this generation. Here's the contradiction at the center of Gen Alpha that nobody in the generational conversation has fully reckoned with. They are the most globally connected, most digitally fluent, most materially equipped generation in human history. And they may also be developing the least tolerance for uncertainty, the least experience of unstructured independence, and the least practice with the kind of open-ended difficulty that adult life is made of. Nearly half of 13-year-olds say they are addicted to their smartphones, and most of them say this matter-of-factly, not as a confession, but as a description of their world. They are more globally aware than any generation at their age, more capable with technology, more informed about social justice, climate, and the complexities of the world they're entering. And simultaneously, attention spans are measurably shorter. Unstructured play has declined sharply. The capacity to sit with boredom, tolerate ambiguity, solve problems without a tutorial. These are skills that require practice. And the environments Gen Alpha inhabits are increasingly engineered to prevent the conditions that build them. This is not a contradiction that resolves neatly. It is the actual state of the research. This generation is simultaneously more capable and more fragile in different directions than any generation before them. And the direction the balance tips depends almost entirely on what happens in the next 10 years of their development, which is still entirely ahead of them. If you're raising a Gen Alpha child right now, you're not just a parent. You're the first generation of parents in history making real-time decisions about technology, screen time, AI access, and digital identity with no roadmap. No research precedent, no generation before you that did this first and reported back. You're doing it live, in the middle of the experiment. And the question researchers keep returning to, the one that appears again and again in the developmental psychology literature, is this. What happens to human development when the environment is optimized for engagement rather than growth? The answer for Gen Alpha will depend on decisions being made right now, in policy, in technology design, in classrooms, in living rooms, in the small daily choice between handing a child a screen and sitting with them in the uncomfortable, necessary, developmental space of not knowing what to do next. Every generation in this series had a wound we could name: the empty house, the broken contract, the shattered optimism, the algorithm that rewired the adolescent brain. For Gen Alpha, we don't have that retrospect yet. They're still children. But here's what we can say. Gen Alpha is the first generation that didn't get to choose who they became online. The algorithm chose for them. They are the most documented and least understood generation in history, the most connected, and potentially the most alone in the ways that matter. They are not broken. They are the result of decisions made for them before they were old enough to make any themselves. By technology companies, by well-meaning parents, by a world moving faster than any map of it could be drawn. And whether they emerge from this as the most resilient, most adaptive, most globally capable generation in history, or as the generation that needed something their childhood couldn't give them, is still being written. By them, by us, by the choices being made right now. We've traveled through 5 generations, 5 different worlds, 5 different sets of wounds and adaptations. And what I hope this series showed is something simple. Every generation makes complete sense when you understand the world that made them. The boomer who seems rigid, the Gen Xer who seems cold, the millennial who seems burned out, the Gen Zer who seems fragile, the alpha who seems addicted. They're not broken, they're shaped. And understanding that doesn't solve the generational conflict, but it makes something else possible, a conversation that doesn't start with blame. If this series changed how you see even one generation, including your own, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Subscribe, because there's more coming. And I'll see you in the next one.